So the next stage in Kent's seminar features an assist in the Standing for Truth channel. With their blatant biblical coin cryptocurrency scam, I will not feature them with the sole exception of telling them to solidly
go fuck yourself!
So without a video from them, we could pull up someone else as a break.
But the important thing to note is that this landscape is actually very stable. I mean, the very fact that there's vegetation there means that there's stability. There was lots of erosion in the past to carve out this whole terrain, but those cliffs and the valley floor are very stable, which is why you've got the vegetation.
So that means that we had a catastrophic period of erosion and then it stopped.
That's right.
No, it just means it took a lot of time. But it gets worse for them.
Oh, really?
Tonight, it's the Is Genesis History channel with Dr. Andrew Snelling. He is a young Earth creationist with a doctorate in geology, which frankly seems like an oxymoron. He is a part of the infamous Answers in Genesis team, which I have found to conflate evidence they find to attempt to assert their narrative without actually asking the deeper questions of why things are the way we observe them. This video is a prime example.
Today, everything's much, much quieter. Today's processes are extremely slow, but they can't explain how we got this erosion, how we got these layers, how we got these cliffs.
Well, yes, we can. It's erosion. If you look at the end of that last clip, you can see the cliffs overlook a plains area, and he mentioned that today's processes are extremely slow. Well, that's the point. It was always slow. The area they're talking about is Sedona, Arizona, and specifically Oak Creek Canyon. Now, the first thing I would expect a young Earth dimwit to say is that it's a creek. It's a small little river that shouldn't be able to do much, right? Not true. I mentioned briefly in the method and idea that caused this in the River Deltas video I did in part 1 of Kent's seminar series, when I noted that the Mississippi River is trying to change its outlet through the Atchafalaya River. But we built levees to slow the rate of change and keep the mighty Mississippi continuing on the path it is on currently. First and foremost, there is a fault line that runs through that area, the Oak Canyon Fault. Because of this fault, when it gives way and causes a quake, the canyon splits, and on occasion, that small little creek isn't so small. Instead, it turns into a river from changes in the climate. As the climate of the area shifts back and forth from humid to arid, the creek takes away most of the debris as it winds and wanders through the growing canyon. The cliffs show massive amounts of wind erosion and not water erosion, so the creek isn't the reason for the canyon. It's the fault line, and we know this from the evidence of basalt lava flows that came up to the surface as the sides of the canyons inched apart over the course of 10 million years. So yes, they are correct when they say the rock is stable. We would expect it to be. However, in a catastrophic flood, the rock would have been washed away with the majority of the surface dirt, and it would take much more than a few paltry thousand years for enough dirt to come back into the canyon for vegetation to flourish all the way up the sides of the canyon. So I suppose that was an explanation of how we got this erosion and how we got those cliffs. I hope I didn't just get too far ahead of this video, so we'll hold off a bit on the layers themselves. I have a feeling about how he's going to try and explain it, though.
All right, so you were saying that you wanted to come here because you see evidence of a young Earth because of what's here. What do you see?
Yes, well, the first thing we notice is the extent of these layers. It's like a stack of pancakes. For example, the red unit that goes all the way across our field of view, that's the Schnebly Hill Formation. And above that, you can see the first white unit is the Coconino Sandstone. And above that, you've got the Turaweep, and at the horizon, you've got the Kaibab Limestone, which is the rim rock of the Grand Canyon.
Thank you for the geology lesson. Lots and lots of layers of stuff. And it's all stretches all the way across state lines. Realistically, that's not even a big deal. So what's his point?
And you know, here we are, 70 more miles from the Grand Canyon, and these layers are still here.
Yeah.
So about an hour's drive. Get on with it.
And the scale is what's important. We're talking about the scale of the sedimentation. If we have a flash flood, it's only in a very localised area, and we're not going to get these nice flat continuous layers that we see here. These layers go for mile after mile after mile. Take the Coconino sandstone. We can trace it from here right across New Mexico, Colorado, right over towards Kansas and Oklahoma, or even in Texas. We're talking at least 200,000 square miles for this one rock unit that's consistent for mile after mile after mile. That's not the scale that we see today.
Okay, there's two things to unpack here. I had to keep them together because of the relationship between them. He's right, at this scale it would not have been a local flood to account for all of this. Actually, it wasn't a flood at all. The Coconino sandstone is not the image he posted. What he did post is the Pennsylvania Permian sandstone sheet, which a part of it is the Coconino sandstone. But of course he doesn't want to mention the Permian era at all, right? Because that would suck for him. Because that is when the Coconino and Greater Sandstone sheet formed. The short version here is that it was laid down after the area turned drastically arid. Just like in the Sahara, where sand is plentiful, erosion whittles down rock, and funny enough, the reason it is called the Pennsylvania Permian Sandstone sheet is a lot of the sand came from the Appalachian mountain chain. Holy fuck, really?
No, really?
Yes. That mountain chain is so old, it dates back to Pangaea. If you look at the landlocking mass of Pangaea and how the continents split apart, you would see the Appalachian mountain chain of North America lines up perfectly with the Scottish Highlands.
Wait, what?
Over millions and millions of years, the continents split apart, but they are the same mountain chain. Over those millions of years, the mountains eroded and the granular sand swept across North America, stopped by the Rocky Mountain chain where it was able to settle. Now, there's a bit of a mindfuck for you, eh? So what's his explanation? Does he give one? Do we care?
Stay tuned.
I set the demon up for that one. Angel, you're up, girl.
With localised sedimentation. And to get it flat lying like this over such a large area, it's like you have to make your pancake all at once very rapidly. And so these layers show evidence of rapid sedimentation, the extent of these layers.
And there it is, the extent of the young Earth mind's coping mechanism. He is claiming that all these layers were laid down by the flood and then eroded by the same flood. So how did they harden into solid rock that he mentioned was a crucial part of the formations while they were still sopping wet mud under the massive amount of water they were swimming in? Let's assume for a moment the flood actually happened and these layers were laid down by water and mud, then hardened quickly after the flood over the course of a few hundred years. What would we expect to see if the area was also eroded by the same flood? Well, after the flood, the water started washing the canyon out. The mud would have washed down into the canyon, sliding the soft mud into the center where the creek now lays. As the water washes out, it would make a gentle sloping valley with gently sloped hillsides, while gravity works on the mud to settle down to the lowest point. What is now the creek would then be surrounded by a lowland area, since the cliffs still need at least some time for all the water to be pressed out. Even if the water could all be pushed out in a matter of a few short years and then turn to rock, the area would still be a gently sloped lowland, as the wet sand was able to harden into stone. But is that what we see?
No.
Correct. So that can't be the case. It is physically impossible for the layers of rock in Sedona to have been laid down by a global flood. It would have been likewise impossible for the creek to have eroded that much rock down in that large of a scale if the flood didn't wash it all away, even if it were possible.
If we dig deeper into the Grand Canyon, we get at the bottom, we've got the Tapete sandstone. That sandstone can be traced right across North America, up into Canada, Across to Greenland, we see the same sandstone with the same features and the same relative position in a stack of pancake layers across northern Africa all the way to southern Israel. So that's across one continent and found on another continent at the same level with the same features.
So I do adore it when they debunk themselves. What he is pointing at is a single layer of sandstone that appears all across all of the continents. It was laid out during the Cambrian epoch at the time of the fragmentation of Rodinia. Pangaea was not the first supercontinent. Rodinia came before Pangaea. However, what he is saying still fits in with what we would expect to see for the layers laid down during the Cambrian epoch. So, good job. We have really old as fuck layers of material, and it would have been laid down precisely as we would expect with the current knowledge and understanding of geology. For a geologist, I would have expected him to do much better research than this.
What other evidence do you see?
Well, the next thing we notice is the boundaries between these layers. They're flat, featureless, knife edge. Generally, you can see the continuity all the way across the vista that we're looking at behind us. And we see the same in the Grand Canyon for mile after mile after mile. There's no evidence of erosion. You think about it, we're looking out here at a landscape where over time we've had erosion. It's still going on down in the creeks when there's the rainstorm. So if you imagine that there was a long time periods between these layers, you would expect to find topographic erosion features.
Very ragged looking.
We don't. We see knife-edge, flat, featureless boundaries. That tells us that the layers were deposited like a stack of pancakes rapidly, one after the other.
Okay, maybe I shouldn't expect better. Look, just because in one area we see nice, even, flat layers doesn't mean everywhere there is. For example, the layers he's talking about are uneven. They are thicker in some areas and thinner in others, both where he is at and in the Grand Canyon itself. But we wouldn't expect to see multiple layers within the layers, like we see in the pictures he provided, if they were all laid down at the same time. And in fact, if they were laid down by a flood, we would expect to see ripples and washing of the layers together. We should see blurred lines in all of the layers, and not perfectly segmented layers at all. But we see segmented layers, as if they were laid down in different stages at different times. If this were all laid down by a flood, how did the layers harden with the water getting squeezed out so the mud could become rock? This is basic high school level geology. Holy fuck, where did he get his doctorate? A trailer park behind the University of Sydney?
The extent of the layers, rapid sedimentation, the lack of erosion between the layers means that you have to have them sequentially laid on top of one another very rapidly.
Stop! Rapid? Like we said before on how this area came about, was not water erosion but wind erosion after a tectonic plate event in the fault line of the area. A still active fault line. And looking at this, it's fairly obvious. I think we can securely say that in the evidence we can see there's no way one singular event could have caused all of this that he sees. But let's assume just for a moment to humor the guy. He wants everyone to think that this valley was carved out of solid rock in a short few thousand years. Using that logic, the entire United States could not exist due to the entire Mississippi floodplain. It would have eroded the entire central USA completely away. And why do we not see that speed of erosion now? His entire argument for the Sedona rock formations just makes absolutely zero sense.
We've already highlighted that red sandstone, the Schneebly Hill Formation.
Yes, but that doesn't sound familiar to me.
No, that's the Schneebly Hill Formation. It's not in the Grand Canyon. In the Grand Canyon, we go from the Coconino into the Hermit Formation. There's that knife edge boundary between the Coconino and the Hermit Formation, and there's no evidence of erosion there, which means that the Hermit Formation was rapidly deposited, and then immediately the Coconino was a deposit on top of it. But here, we've come 70 miles from the Grand Canyon, and we've got this Schneebly Hill Formation between the Coconino and the Hermit. And this Schnebler Hill Formation, 800 to 1,000 feet thick, over an area of 1,000 square miles, had to have been formed very rapidly.
He goes on about a few of the rock formations found in Sedona and the Grand Canyon, with the Schnebler Hill Formation not seen in the Grand Canyon. I cut it back to the general meat of it. Well, yes, I bet he won't mention the occasional layer of limestone that creeps out occasionally in the middle of the Schnebler Hill rock layers. So if that were laid down in a matter of hours like he asserts, where did the distinct sandstone come in the middle of it? The fact that that exists in the midst of all is a defeater for his garbage. Next, he talks about the erosion that he thinks is an issue. Again, he doesn't understand that there was no creek running through there until after the tectonic plates started shifting the area apart and started the diversion of the two sides of the canyon. This allowed rainfall to have a path of least resistance through the canyon instead of going around it. But once it did start, volcanic basalt was able to come up and keep the basin of the canyon relatively flat. He doesn't address this either. If this was all water erosion, like he tries to say, the canyon here would look like the Grand Canyon, with sides of the canyon sloping down to the creek itself, or in the Grand Canyon's case, the river. Again, that is not what we see, so he is wrong. Someone take his doctorate away from him, please, before he hurts himself or anyone else.
If that took millions of years, we ought to see millions of years, evidence of millions of years erosion back in the Grand Canyon at that same boundary. We don't. So that means that Schnebler Hill Formation in this area had to form in a matter of hours.
Incorrect again. And this time we can address his erosion claims. We do see evidence of erosion. Wind erosion. Wind erosion in the Grand Canyon and wind erosion in Sedona. That's why it's so flat. Water erosion will make for deep crevices, while wind erosion will render the layers material flattish. An example of this is the plain states of the United States. Over time, the plain states have become mostly flat and featureless, with some exceptions of the occasional hill. Now, why don't we see millions of years of erosion in the Grand Canyon layers? Simple. It's a plateau. That is being pushed up from underneath by volcanic forces. The movement is very slow, but before it started, there was no river there to erode that rock. So wind erosion caused the layers to be uniformly consistent, while later, when the river started running through, it started carving the layers of rock away more and more as the plateau moved up. Now, the interesting point through all of this, he mentioned that he thinks it was all laid down by the same water event. So for a moment, what would we expect to see if this were the case? Well, all the water was flowing across the world, so all the mud and dirt was mixing together globally. We should then expect to see all layers to be uniform across the entirety of the globe. But we don't. What we should expect to see, when I mentioned earlier, is ripples down the layers from liquidity, keeping the layers unconformed as the new layers are laid down. But we don't. What we should expect to see is two layers being gradiated from one to the next as the one below is still hardening. But that never happens, because the water wouldn't be able to be pressed out until the layer above is thick enough and heavy enough to push down by gravity. None of these layers we see in Sedona Formation have evidence of being laid down by a singular flood, so they must have laid down by some other means. So the next question is, does he say anything that contradicts his own points?
Yeah.
Really?
Well, Andrew, even though we have those very thick layers, within them we have these smaller layers. It's kind of like what I saw at Mount St. Helens. What's going on with those?
Well, that's a good case in point. At Mount St. Helens, we had over a 20-foot layer deposited in just a couple of hours, but the sediment flow, within it, the grains sorted out into these laminated layers that were different grain sizes. We see it here on a much larger scale in the Schnebler Hill Formation. You can see these bands, and you can think of that in terms of water currents bringing in the sand grains and settling with different slightly particle sizes over an enormous area very, very rapidly.
So we explain why the layers in Sedona couldn't have been put down by water, and then he shows how layers near St. Helens perfectly mirror the same effect we see over at Sedona. Both of them were dry layer formations without water. Perfectly flat, perfectly even, and perfectly uniform, without erosional evidence between them. Now, the layers shown over at St. Helens just have to take time to settle and harden into rock, and some future civilization will get to see it all. Good job showing evidence against his own claim without realizing he's showing evidence against his own claim. These young earthers are funny. Does he debunk himself again?
Yes!
You're kidding.
No.
Let's have it then.
What other evidence do you see?
Well, if we look closely, for example, at the Coconino sandstone, we see within the horizontal layer, we see the bedding, that there's bands within it that are sloping. We call those cross beds. And what they indicate is that you had underwater sand waves were moving along. The comparison is in a desert. Most people understand a desert with a sand dune and the wind blowing the sand forward. Well, underwater, we see the same thing, sand waves. And so the water current is rapidly moving it along, and what we get left behind are these front-facing slopes. And we can estimate the depth of water, the speed of the water current, and we can do this with a Coconino sandstone. In actual fact, it's important to recognise that there's a difference in the angle in a desert dune. It's usually 30 to 34 degrees of these sloping beds. Whereas underwater, it's usually 25 degrees or less. And in the Coconino sandstone, these cross beds are always 15 to 25 degrees.
And he thinks that's good for him?
Nailed it!
He does realize that as the layers compact and compress from sand to sandstone, that the angles will become more acute. Right?
Oh, no.
I mean, any geologist would know that. The soft sand pressing down and being weighed down, settling and compacting will take those dunes at the less acute angle and make them more acute. If this were laid down by water, by his logic, we would then expect to see the sandstone be even more acute than it already is. And we would expect all the layers to have that same angular sway in the layers, but he himself said that is not what's happening. So he's contradicting his earlier claims. Good job. Isn't that neat? Sometimes these young earthers have no idea what they're actually saying before it's too late. I think we're done with this guy.
Thanks for another forgettable experience.
Yeah, pretty much. For a geologist, he's really just using his credentials to assert his failed logic as fact without scrutiny. But he's just really dishonest. Any last words for him, Demon?
Get the fuck out.
We were being so cordial.
I'm sorry. We don't give a fuck.
Yeah, this was pretty bad. It deserves ridicule.
Nailed it like the fucking Romans.
Well, I am Corsi, and this is the Fluffy Atheist. Pet those like and subscribe buttons, and remember, a little research will go a long way. Let the Fluffy Atheist do it for you.